Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lecture, I'm going to focus on understanding our place in history and developing theological vision. So let me just start off on the biblical importance of understanding our place in history. So there's the Greek word kairos, which is the opportune and decisive moment. And that's used a lot in the Bible. In Isaiah, it says, "See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland." And then in Esther, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" And the sons of Issachar, who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And Jesus, this is a paraphrase, but I love this phrase, "I do what I see the Father doing." Each of these talks about how God's doing a new thing, and we're uniquely called. The question is, how do we understand that? How do we understand what is the new thing? What is our call? So in terms of diffusion of innovation that I've referenced in several other lectures, you kind of have this growth trajectory, and then you have this misalignment, and you have this kairos moment where you kind of need a new wineskin, a recontextualization, a new theological vision. It's difficult and dangerous. And often what happens, if many of today's problems are a result of yesterday's solution. So, I work in urban ministry, and, in Boston, yesterday's problems were, urban decline. But they came up with solutions where it was basically don't let anyone build houses except in rare occasions, so that the value of houses went up. So now we have this problem with housing affordability. And that's a problem that was basically created by yesterday's solutions. If you look at urban planning, almost all the schools, that's what they taught. And the solutions they had for urban planning now are creating today's problems. So what we need is dual expertise in developing new wineskins. So understanding the tradition, understanding the how and why, and understanding innovation, emerging trends and models. So for me, let me talk with you about my approach to studying history. So, I read common historical narratives. So these are typically secularizing. What they do is typically they deconstruct Christian history, and they're also Eurocentric. Then I've also read through alternative cultural understandings of history by key ethnic groups. Now, it's important to recognize that these histories are based on facts. So these aren't just people making up histories. It's just facts that are most relevant to them, and that are often ignored. So that's Black history, Latina history, Asian history, or Asian American history. And these can deconstruct the dominant European-centric historical narrative while reconstructing their own narrative. And then there's issue-based history. So you can read about the history of poverty, injustice, racism, homelessness, addiction, climate, housing, global poverty. And then also reconstructing Christian history has been a big theme. So, this book, two books that have been most helpful for me in this, How Christianity Changed the World and How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. And these are all historical facts, and they're historical facts that were left out of generally the secularized histories. And so, histories of Christian secularization. So I've read a lot about how Christian colleges were secularized, how radio was secularized, how the YMCA was secularized, church history, parachurch history, history of theology, a book, The Prospering Parachurch, Histories of Rescue Missions, the Salvation Army, the Black Church, the Latina Church, Histories of Religion and Science, Magisteria is a really good one. And then ministry founding stories, like 60 Great Founders. So, all of this is to understand, if I'm going to innovate, I need to understand what's happened in the past, right? So here's some things: tradition, history, best practices. So invest in writing an extensive organizational history to define organizational culture. Now, Shine, the kind of guru on culture, who's written almost all the academic books on culture, he says that organizational culture is the accumulated shared learning of the group as it solves its problems of external adaptation and internal integration. So that's changing, responding to the environment and how you integrate that. Ultimately, as you write history with this lens in mind. That's really important. Don't just randomly write factual history. You're also defining culture. So you need to be able to explain what actually happened that created your current culture. So have all staff read your organization's history and the history of the movement and kind of the larger Christian, movement. And ultimately, the goal is to become a thought leader of histories on key issues, to understand the full historical tree of your organization and tradition, the movement, related movement, parent movements, parachurch history, church history, history of secular counterparts, historical critique of your movement, and do all this to write and update your organizational history to inspire, define its culture, and contextualize its current Kairos moment. This is challenging. I mean, this is really hard to do that, but ultimately that's a part of leadership. Become an expert in communicating your organization's history to inspire and expand your influence with various audiences. So, I mentioned that this could be, this course and the lectures can be inspiring for a doctoral program. This could be a project, self-study project, for a doctoral or even a master's program. So then my approach in studying innovation. So I focus my studies on the intersection of our values of Jesus, justice, technology. Most of the books that I read are at the intersection of one or two of our values. So Jesus, justice, or just justice. Typically, I try to balance out perspectives, Christian versus secular, left versus right, academic versus practical, majority culture versus non-majority culture. I read a lot of contemporary books on topics covered in history research from the previous slide, but also topics that are of interest to our partners. So poverty, injustice, racism, homelessness, addiction, those things. And then a lot of it's networking. So meeting with 200 to 300 ministries per year, seeking out experts, mentors, peer learning communities on key topics, and creating those communities of inquiry. And then loose connections, the big picture and wide range antenna. So a lot of YouTube presentations, webinars, The Economist, books on macro trends, innovation-centered conferences, and more recently using AI tools. So ultimately what we're trying to do with all of this is understanding our place in history. So there's, Western society, Western Christianity, American Christianity, U.S. parachurch ministries in your ministry, and understanding, okay, what is our place in history? Now, I'm going to frame part of our place in history. So a lot of our ministries serve the poor and the addicted. So I'm going to try to frame some of these issues. You may have different issues, but this is just, high level. If I were to create a synthesis that's saying, okay, what are some of the big mega trends that are happening? You may pay attention to other mega trends. So one mega trend is that there's more challenges to religious freedom than at any other point in U.S. history. If you don't believe that, you haven't read history that well, and you've read mostly histories that are trying to deconstruct Christianity that say that that's not true. But if you read histories by just about any measure, that's true. So two countries politically were more there's more denominational splits at any other point in U.S. history, except for around the Civil War. This is creating intense pressures to secularize from funders and the public. And I believe that there's likely to be a wave of secularization of Christian institutions not seen since the wave of secularization of Christian colleges. So, the framework for this whole course in these lectures is, it's Christian truth and tension, not an or, but an and. So how do we innovate and how do we honor tradition? How do we do both of those? So, there's kind of a question of what's the role of Christians in solving society's great problems. And I feel like that's what we're trying to do in ministry. So I'm an innovation guy, as I mentioned. So this is kind of a technology adoption lifestyle. Ignore the word technology, but this could be any sort of problem where you're going to have problems that, once you get to the middle, that's affecting 50% of society. Now, what's happened is that many of the problems have diffused really rapidly, but the church's solutions are here. And I'm going to use, a few different quotes that frame that. So Alvin Toffler, he is a futurist, and he has a quote that says, "Man has a limited biological capacity for change. When this capacity is overwhelmed, the capacity is in future shock." And in many ways, things are just moving too quickly, and the church hasn't been able to keep up. Another quote, H.G. Wells, "History is a race between education, and I would argue diffusion of innovation, and catastrophe." And, in some places we're keeping up, in some ways we aren't. Jesus, as I mentioned the quote, "I do what I see the Father doing." And then, I believe our job as Christians is to discern what God is doing and play our role in that becoming a movement that helps solve society's great problems. So, what are the major social crises today? Well, Christian decline. So this comes from individualism, decline in church attendance, the rise of the nuns, so no affiliation, being assimilated into political identity, as I talked about, the mega identity. The declines actually increased significantly among the poor, especially, and you're having church division. And then you have moral decline. You have decline of the family, political polarization, disconnectedness. You just look at our politics that's happening. Then you have the chemical addiction epidemic. So drugs, opioid, meth, fentanyl, alcohol, and tobacco. You have what I would call a behavioral addiction epidemic. So, gaming addiction, TV addiction, sex addiction, online social media addiction, food, obesity, and then you have poverty and injustice, so homelessness, racism, deaths of despair, declining middle class, living wage, lack of living wage jobs, sexism, healthcare shortage, housing prices, the effect of climate change on the poor, rising mental health issues. You can create your own list, but I want to focus on some of the ones that are most affecting the students that come to City Vision. So a lot of them are these. And I want to pull out some of the key data that I've collected through a lot of the reading that I've done. So the decline of Christianity in America. So this is Pew Research, and so this is the rising of religiously unaffiliated, and then you have other religions. You can see from 1972 to now going down from 90% to 63%. And then you have the opioid epidemic. Now, this graphic here is showing three things. Basically, the deaths that are happening from opioids, pharmaceutical, and then heroin, and then synthetic like fentanyl. And what you see is that from 1999 to now, this is a very small little piece of pie. This is a very large piece of pie. And it's grown and spiraled hugely. So in the waves, you started, initially on opioids for pain relief, and then you had heroin after you put more controls on that, and then the rise from fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. And then there's been a lot of attention on what's called the rise of death of despair, and this is from several researchers who pulled together different what they call deaths of despair. So the rise of death from drugs, the alcohol-related deaths, and suicide deaths. And they targeted the demographics of this, and they saw that it shot up since 2000. And there are particular groups that this affected the most. In particular, those are poor and just struggling to get by in various contexts. So, and then you have the housing and homelessness crisis. And, in certain cities, or not certain cities, in certain states, these numbers look high, but whenever it shoots up this quickly and you have another, 20,000, 30,000 homeless individuals, some of the largest rescue missions might have beds for 500 or 1,000 people. And all of a sudden you're adding, in New York City, my understanding is there's 100,000 homeless immigrants that have emerged over the past decade or so. There's just not enough beds for those people, close to 100,000 homeless immigrants that, throughout a year. This is I think counts on any given day. So all of a sudden you're having these huge growth. So what's some historical comparisons and lessons? So one common pattern in history is once society decides to address a problem or issue at scale, that sector becomes secularized and religious organizations decline. So examples of this: K-12 education, higher education, hospitals, mental hospitals. All of these were pioneered by religious groups, by Christian groups in the U.S. Primarily, and eventually, once society decides to address that issue at scale, they basically the Christian role dramatically decreased. It didn't have necessarily end. So it's important to consider what's unique role that Christian approaches provide. So let me just use an example. Limited distinction of Christian. So hospitals, mental hospitals, maybe affordable housing. A Christian approach to hospitals might be somewhat important, but to be honest, if I were picking a surgeon, I don't really care whether the surgeon is Christian or not. I just want the best possible surgeon. And most people probably feel that way with hospitals. On strong distinction, or stronger distinction, education, shelters for the homeless, addiction recovery, things along those lines. So what's the historical lesson that applies here? The scale of the growth of homelessness and addiction are likely to create immense pressures for secularization, similar to what happened with education in hospitals. This is going to be most pressing in states with the biggest problems with these issues, like California and New York, and the most leftist cultures, largely big coastal cities. So with that, what we're trying to do is basically prepare people, and this is kind of the whole point of this course and all of these lectures. So what you have to do is you can't change your core theology, you can't change your doctrinal foundation, but the point of theological vision is to be able to get your core values and your mission, vision, values, your ministry DNA, your philosophy of ministry, your theory of change, and in particular, your priorities and emphases. Those will change over time at a particular culture in a moment of history. And then how that aligns is your ministry expression. So let me just use an example of some different things. So the goals of this course is what we're trying to do is help you accelerate the diffusion of innovation in your organization while staying true to your mission and values and avoiding secularization to help your organization and movement survive. So what we're trying to do is help you increase the speed here. So let me just use an example of two new innovations that have happened. So Narcan is amazing. It saved lots of lives. So if someone is about to die from an opioid overdose, you give them a Narcan shot, and it saves their life. So that's not controversial. It needs to diffuse very quickly. Almost every ministry that has a residential recovery program and works with the homeless is using that now. So it's adopted very quickly. Now there's other things like EMDR, which if you're familiar with trauma, it's a technique used to treat trauma. It is so surprising to me how well it works, and that it works, but it does work. There's very little controversy on it, but it's kind of more technically difficult to implement and also more risky. You have to have some good clinical training on it, but it's also a game changer. Most ministries aren't that far on ability to work with EMDR. In a lot of cases, they just don't have the capacity to use EMDR for trauma treatment. Now, for a lot of the clients that they're dealing with, EMDR isn't going to be the magic bullet, because EMDR, in terms of trauma treatment, it's best with what's called simple trauma, where there's one or maybe a few traumatic events, whereas most clients that come to rescue missions have complex trauma, so it's not as magical in that case. But the point is, how do we move this more quickly so that people learn these things? So I want to talk about a challenge of change agents with advanced degrees. So you have this technology adoption life cycle, and you have new innovations that you discovered. So you're an innovator, and you're here at the cutting edge on that thing. Now here's the challenge: is you need to have expertise in all four quadrants of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, and we have other lectures that talk about that. And you need to have strong leadership skills needed to cross the chasm. A lot of times people know what to do, but they just can't get it done. The other thing you got to realize is that many innovations are bad ideas and might lead to secularization. So I'm an entrepreneur, man. I've come up with way more bad ideas than I've come up with good ideas. I've come up with way more ideas that didn't work. Why do we think that that's any different for things that might influence our values? So I've messed up. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, So I think that we just have to recognize. So effectiveness is going to be limited by your ability to lead others through the process of discernment and experimentation while limiting risk. So that's what we're trying to do is, equip people to have better expertise for that. So, what we're trying to do is to help empower movement. So, I've talked about how movements happen. So movements happen when someone aligns a new theological vision and ministry of expression with what God's doing in a particular context in a way that enables it to spread. So you have these innovation, hubs or sub movements. In the last generation, say among rescue missions, for example, there was a diffusion of certain innovations that were absolutely game changers. And so rescue missions in the 1980s, most of them hadn't adopted these things. So, citywide direct mail, Christian recovery, thrift store innovation, client tracking systems. I'll just use Christian recovery. In the 1980s, my understanding, from Michael Limata, who is our founding dean of City Vision University, he said that Christian recovery was a bad word in the 80s. But over time, most Citygate members are using a Christian recovery approach, right? Most of them are doing citywide direct mail. Most of them are doing thrift. Most of them are doing client tracking. That doesn't mean that client tracking is over its peak. I would say direct mail is over its peak. I don't think that Christian recovery is over its peak, but the point is that more missions have adopted these things. So these were key innovations, and they had to get diffused among rescue missions in the past generation. Now, what are the key innovations that are needed in this generation? And rescue missions are just one example of a movement. So if you're part of a different movement, you can think of different innovations in your movement. But I would argue that here's some of the innovations that are needed. So cultural adaptation in post-Christian cities, adapting to new social crises, whether it's fentanyl or the immigration crisis in certain cities, changing funding models, dramatically different, technology change. Now, here's the dilemma. I don't know if you've heard of this term called the Overton window, but the idea behind the Overton window is that every organization, every culture has an Overton window that limits norms and limits debate. And, part of that I feel like is healthy. If you have it too narrow, it's not healthy, right? And what it does is, so within an organization, okay, this is basically the party line, and then people might differ a little bit from the party line. Okay, you can be over here and you don't think you're crazy, but if you're over here, you're crazy. If you're over on this side, you're crazy. So here's the problem of what happens with most organizations is they have an Overton window that either believes in innovation or believes in tradition. And honestly, if I had to say what is the biggest problem happening right now that concerns me more than anything else, it's that I see this happening where there are two groups, and you have one group that is the tradition camp and another group that's the innovation camp, and they all think alike. So, the tradition camp is, people who are less comfortable with change. They typically have the most conservative theology. There's leaders from within the tradition. From a personality type, these are the people who are detail-oriented and organized. These are the operations and accountant types. Not that if you're an operations accountant, you're always going to be focused on tradition, but that gives you kind of a predisposition to be, to go towards that. So, and then you have the innovation and change. And what you have is you have this Overton window that's primarily focused on avoiding secularization. And then on the other side, you have an entrepreneurial Overton window, and you must agree with the need for change. And examples of traits. So you're more comfortable with change, more moderate theology, you get more leaders outside the tradition that you're hiring. You have Myers-Briggs. So this is my Myers-Briggs. I'm intuitive. That means big picture, and perceiving, which I like new things. Entrepreneurs. Now, here's the thing that bothers me more than anything else right now. I go to conferences. I go to different contexts, and I see the windows being limited. I see one conference that's all tradition. I see another conference that's all innovation and change. And it drives me nuts because I feel like they're both not healthy. So we have to bring that together. So that's part of the point of this talk is we got to do that. We have to have conferences where we have a wider Overton window, so to speak. We have to let people who have ideas that may be a little bit uncomfortable, not that we're going to let completely crazy ideas, saying there is no God or, things along those lines, or, heretical beliefs. But the point is that we need to be combining these two. We need to embrace tradition. I feel like we've swung the pendulum. The rescue mission movement used to be here. It swung over here. I want to bring it back to value both of these deeply. And that's something that is just part of who I am. I've read, a couple hundred books on history, read probably twice as much on innovation and change, but I love both. So we're doing the Rescue Mission History Project or Heritage Project. And so the reason why we're doing this is, if you look at the Rescue Mission movement, there's a limited history of the movement. Often those in the Rescue Mission movement are so focused on doing and saving lives that not much of its history has been documented. The Rescue Mission movement has had very few comprehensive histories written about it, especially compared to the groups like the Salvation Army. About 10 years ago, I went and I tried to read every book I could find. I found like 20 books that were still unpublished about the Salvation Army's history. There's almost none written about the Rescue Mission movement. They're all out of print. I could still get the books, but they're all out of print. So what we're trying to do with the Rescue Mission History and Heritage Project is we're trying to make the history of the movement more widely available, to collectively expand the historical documentation of the movement. We're digitizing many of the histories of the Rescue Mission movement. We're going to compile these histories into an AI system that can be used as a learning and research tool. And we hope to expand this to other movements in the future. So this is, where you can find it. We have a page where we're starting to compile that. So hopefully you get the message out of this. Learn to be a student of history, learn to be a student of innovation, and bring those together to figure out how do we bring life change. Thanks a lot.